It has been a chaotic year, to say the least. For Ukrainians, the highlight has likely been the success of its drone campaign against Russian refineries. Their biggest frustration has undoubtedly been trying to navigate the United States' sense of diplomacy. Well, the New York Times recently published a very deep dive into the last year of the war, based on insider accounts from the White House. It takes about an hour to read, but it is very interesting and worth your time if you really care about what is happening in the war. However, pretty much right after the article came out, the fracas in Caracas happened. And as tense as that situation remains, I do not think that we should completely forget about how there is a major land war in Europe still ongoing. In any case, what I want to do today is cover some of the most important things that we have learned from the article. And there are a lot of super captivating things to talk about here. From the reason Russia cannot repair its refineries in a timely manner, to another front that the CIA has been assisting Ukraine with, to the journey of Pete Hegseth, to the literal line that Ukraine drew on a map, to the surprising person who wanted Zelensky to stay for lunch after the Oval Office meltdown. But I am selling this video as explaining what happened with the refineries, so let's start with that arc. And the story here begins with Ukraine's biggest advocate within the Trump administration. I think if we were pressed to hazard a guess on that before the article, Special Envoy to Ukraine Keith Kellogg would have been the obvious choice. Well, the article includes an interesting anecdote about how in 2000, Kellogg developed a staph infection in his elbow after visiting the Russian embassy. Ultimately, he narrowly avoided an amputation. To this day, Kellogg is unsure whether it was an assassination attempt. So, yeah, he is not a fan of Russia. However, consistent with the public speculation on the matter, Trump and Kellogg have frequently clashed with one another, and it seems that Kellogg's hard line against Russia was a big part of that. As a result, Ukraine's biggest advocate, or at least its most effective advocate, has been CIA Director John Ratcliffe. Under Ratcliffe, CIA spending on Ukraine has increased, not decreased. I know a lot of the public's focus on U.S. aid to Ukraine turns to lethal weapons, and it is true that the cuts there have been massive, something that we will pick back up on later today. Simultaneously, though, metal is not the only part of a war effort. Even after Trump froze aid to Ukraine in March following the Oval Office meltdown, Ratcliffe successfully lobbied Trump to continue sharing intelligence regarding Russian threats in Ukraine, lest there be spillover consequences to CIA officers stationed there. It also helps that Ratcliffe is a frequent golf partner of the president's, meaning that he has Trump's ear. But perhaps Ratcliffe's greatest contribution to Ukraine's war effort has been the trick to the refinery campaign. From early on, we have known that the Trump administration was contributing to the effort by providing intelligence. Previously, though, the belief was that the United States was only providing information regarding the location of Russia's air defenses, allowing Ukraine to choose routes to potential targets that would maximize the chances that any particular drone would make it all the way. That is indeed happening, but there are a few other interesting tidbits. 1. The United States started to coordinate strike locations, which means at some level the Trump administration has been choosing Russian targets to destroy. Ukraine, by contrast, had multiple agencies selecting targets, leading to a lack of a coherent strategy. Ratcliffe sought to rectify that. Now, the Biden administration had participated in a ton of target selection as well, but notably that was limited to Russian targets on internationally recognized Ukrainian soil. In contrast, as the map shows here, Russia itself is now in the crosshairs, and the United States has emphasized narrowing the focus to oil refineries. Even within that category, the CIA noticed that Ukraine had previously aimed for fuel tanks. These attacks led to large explosions, wasted fuel, and splashy social media posts, but it was doing virtually nothing to cause long-term damage. However, an oil industry expert at the CIA discovered that destroying a single coupler inside of the refineries could shut down the entire enterprise. There are a bunch of components in refineries that fit such a description, of course, But what made this one unique was that Russia could not easily replace it. You see, the Russian oil industry as a whole has seen its human capital fall off of a cliff following the fall of the Soviet Union. Russia mitigated the problem by relying on international experts, which worked great until sanctions isolated the industry. The CIA estimates the damage to Russia is $75 million per day, or about $27 billion per year. For perspective, the annual Russian federal budget in 2024 was roughly $500 billion. Look, I know after 4 years, the war has burnt out a lot of people. It is understandable. But it is the dumb, boring, and mundane things like this that win wars. One more extraneous point about CIA targeting assistance. While the bulk of energy infrastructure targeting has been on refineries and pipelines, a few oil tankers have been hit on the Black Sea, and another one on the Mediterranean. Well, the CIA again has been providing assistance for Ukraine's drones there. The article does not explain how, but there are a couple of possibilities. 1. The Shadow Fleet has been known to spoof locations. The United States could be providing precise location data to Ukraine. Alternatively, Ukraine needed to have access to the Mediterranean to strike on the Mediterranean. That sounds like the type of thing that the CIA excels at. Moving away from the CIA, the article has a bunch of insights about Pete Hegseth. He came into the role as Secretary of Defense as a blank slate, which helps explain why it often seems that defense policy is a moving target. Hegseth did not get a running start either. Biden ordered his administration to begin a cordial and orderly transition, which Trump welcomed. Almost all of Trump's picks had conversations with their Biden-era counterparts during the transition. However, Hegseth did not meet with Lloyd Austin. Along those lines, General Christopher Cavoli, then the commander of the U.S. European Command and the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, keep in mind that second job for later, used to provide detailed updates to Austin about Ukraine every day except for Sundays. Hegseth believed that was too much. The updates eventually became 4 or 5 sentences per week. The article confirms that over time, Under-Secretary of Defense for Policy Bridge Colby became the leading voice inside of the Pentagon. He had long advocated to preserve stockpiles of key weapons, like 155mm artillery shells, or either of the missiles that HIMARS uses. This was a sharp break from Biden-era policy. Zelensky even visited a 155mm production line in Scranton to promote the connection. But that fell apart after the transition, and the Pentagon got very good at dragging its feet in providing aid to Ukraine, even in contradiction to Trump's orders. Ignore the smiles here. Cavoli eventually became frustrated with Hegseth, and the feeling was mutual. Indeed, at one point Hegseth wanted to fire Cavoli. The only thing that stopped him was that Cavoli was the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, or SACEUR for short. The SACEUR coordinates NATO military activity. The deputy SACEUR was Keith Blunt, a British admiral. Someone at the Pentagon pointed out to Hegseth that if Cavoli was relieved of duty, it would temporarily put a European in charge of US forces under NATO. Cavoli therefore survived for a time. Another recurring theme of the article is the inconsistency of US foreign policy. I know that the prevailing online narrative is that all of the Trump administration's decisions on the international stage are the result of intentional malice. However, the New York Times reporting indicated that a good share is from inconsistencies between the desires of competing White House factions, which has been a recurring theme on this channel. Perhaps the peak indication of the uncoordinated chaos was a February meeting between Hegseth and Ukrainian Minister of Defense, Rustem Umerov. Ukraine was trying to develop a defense plan in the Trump era. Plans require foresight, however, and everything that the Trump administration had done at that point had made the prediction game impossible. At the meeting, Umerov told Hegseth, quote, "I just need you to be honest with me. Just be honest with me. It was one thing for Ukraine to get its weapons shipments cut off. It was another thing for Ukraine to not even be able to plan for the loss. At least if Ukraine knew, it could optimize for the situation, all while Russia would remain in the dark and not be able to counterplan accordingly." But Hegseth could not give Umarov an honest answer, in part because he had not yet decided his own policy, never mind that he did not know whether his policy would win the internal White House debate. This lack of coordination has carried over into the administration's diplomatic efforts. Some proposals have contradicted other proposals, and White House officials sometimes only learn of this when Ukrainian officials tell them. In other words, sometimes Ukraine has better lines of communication with the White House than the various White House departments do internally, even if it has done nothing for Ukraine's military efforts. But let's go back to Hegseth and another pivotal moment in the war. That meeting with Umarov took place during the February NATO Defense Ministerial Conference. You might remember it as the one that I attended and had the opportunity to ask Secretary General Mark Rutte a question. Well, Hegseth also set the agenda for the ministerial by telling the press the day before that, quote, "We must start by recognizing that returning to Ukraine's pre-2014 borders is an unrealistic objective." Now, to be clear, the conversations that I have had with people who would know have indicated that no one within NATO doubted the factual accuracy of that statement. Many allies objected to saying it aloud, though. They thought that making this the public expectation effectively gave a concession to Russia without receiving anything in return. The administration's thought process here was that the lack of public acknowledgement of this reality was setting unrealistic expectations for Western voters. Heck, almost a full year later, you can still see the "Putin is done" mantra all over social media, even as public diplomacy has moved well past that point. Hold thoughts about lines on maps for a moment. Regardless of whether the Hegseth comments were the right play, the administration started to fumble the rest of the diplomatic process. The article also confirms what we already knew about the failures there. Trump wants to get a deal done. Getting a deal done requires exerting leverage over Russia. Doing that takes away stockpiles from the Indo-Pacific, and so nothing ends up happening. And that takes us to the penultimate revelation. What happened after the Oval Office meltdown, only 2 weeks following the just described NATO meeting. I will spare you the backstory. World War III, you don't have the cards. Have you said thank you once since you got here? You remember it all. A minor revelation from the article is that Zelensky's advisors had told him to go through the standard Trump praise that has become common for anyone meeting with the president. Zelensky did not, and so we got this instead of a simple signing of a minerals deal. Now, the schedule for the day was to begin with some simple comments to the press inside of the Oval Office, followed by a lunch. The surprising revelation is that Trump actually wanted to continue with the lunch, despite the public blowout. He understood exactly what had happened, but did not see a reason why it had to spoil the rest of the afternoon. His attitude was, quote, "Let's just have the lunch and talk our way through it." Instead, then National Security Advisor Mike Waltz argued that Zelensky had disrespected Trump, and so Ukraine should be sent packing. And as we all know, that argument won. Finally, we have the main event of the evening, a real-life line on a map. On March 11th, the United States began its mediation process in earnest with Ukraine. Marco Rubio unfurled a map of Ukraine on the bargaining table. Mike Waltz gave Umarov a marker and asked him to draw a line to represent Ukraine's demands. Umarov complied and mostly traced the line of contact, with 2 exceptions. 1. He circled the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant as a pain point, but the reservation came without a practical solution. It sits on the opposite side of the Dnipro River, so any Ukrainian control over it would come with an immediate security risk. Second, the line cut sharply south at the Kinburn Spit. It also sits at the opposite end of the Dnipro. However, the shipyards of Mykolaiv are up here, and so Ukraine views safety over this corridor as vital to its national security. But yes, Ukraine literally drew that line on a map. I remember 4 years ago when I started speaking publicly about crisis bargaining theory, all of the angry comments about how that is something that never happens in real life. Yeah, about that. Speaking of lines on maps, you will get a ton of them with these 2 fantastic books about the war. Well, actually more so with the one on the right, but they're both great. Check the video description for more information on them. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.